Quick disclaimer. This podcast is for educational purposes only. Always consult your certified flight instructor, aircraft manuals, and current regulations before applying any of the techniques or interpretations discussed here.
Hello and welcome to Helicopter Training Podcast, Episode 2. In this episode, we'll discuss how to hover a helicopter, covering the controls, aerodynamics, check rate standards, and tips on learning and teaching how to hover a helicopter. The last episode of the podcast focused on how to become a helicopter pilot, and that was covering things like the training path and certifications, the age, medical, and education requirements, as well as how to choose the right flight school and what type of helicopter you want to train in. There was also things like options for financing, how to get started, including free and cheap ways to begin studying on your own before you start out of flight school. So if you're thinking about getting into helicopters or you know someone who's interested, definitely check that episode out or pass it along. And on that note, someone reached out after the episode and shared a really helpful FAA website. It lists all the FAA approved Part 141 flight schools, and it's searchable by state or by distance from your location. So thanks for that, and I'll put the link in the show notes. It's been far too long since the last episode, and apologies for the delay there. Things have been incredibly busy behind the scenes, so in addition to doing my day-to-day job of helping run the flight school, there's a lot that's happened over the past few months. One of the major highlights was I got back into the Bell 206 and started teaching turbine transition and mounting flying courses. And before teaching that, I really had to go back to being a student to review all the systems limitations and emergency procedures to make sure it was up to an instructional standard. So there was some empathy there for what it was like to be back as a student studying, just to get up to speed again. The flight school also hosted the first off-site Robinson Instructor Standardization course, and we had the chief instructor from Robinson and several factory pilots come up to Central Oregon. And despite the weather kind of turning on us a little bit partway through the week, we managed to get 12 recently qualified CFI students through the Robinson ground and flight training. So as you may know, the instructor course differs from the standard Robinson safety course, and it's relatively new. It's a pass-fail. It's not just an attendance thing. It's designed really to raise the instructional level knowledge and flying skills and to standardize that in the Robinson product. And, it was a fantastic opportunity for me to sit in on the ground sessions and then fly with the chief instructor, G. For anyone teaching in Robinson helicopters, this course is highly recommended. And then those who pass are added onto the Robinson's approved instructor list. I also went to Dallas, got to attend the largest helicopter event on the planet, VERTICON, which is formerly known as HAI's Heli Expo. So while there, our flight school presented a scholarship, and it was also a time for me to get and sit in a lot of the educational sessions that they have going on. I got a look at the new Robinson R88, amongst other things, got to explore the exhibit floor, and reconnect with some friends and colleagues from across the industry. I also thought I spotted Tony Robinson of Time Team and Blackadder fame. Look him up if you don't know what I'm talking about. But after talking to him, he denied it was him when I approached him. I still managed to get a quick photo. Still not 100% sure either way which whether that was him or not. In safety news, I joined both the Vertical Aviation Safety Team, or VAST, and the FAA's Rotorcraft Collective. So VAST is a global initiative that works with industry and government groups in many countries to promote safety, share data, and develop best practices for vertical flight operations. And the Rotorcraft Collective is a joint FAA industry initiative that produces short educational videos aimed at reducing helicopter accidents. I've been helping out with a few of the newest scripts, created some B-roll content, and helped edit one of the upcoming videos, which should be out shortly, which focuses on loss of control. But in the meantime, before that video releases, make sure to check out the Rotorcraft Collective on YouTube. You can see their entire playlist, and I'll put links to that in the show notes. So through those two volunteer positions, I also learned more about a great initiative that the US Helicopter Safety Team, or USHST, has been working on, called the Peer Pilot Program. So this is a free support program that connects trained volunteer pilots with those seeking guidance, like a listening ear, peer-level support for mental health concerns. And because it's peer-to-peer support and not medical treatment, participation in this program doesn't need to be reported to the FAA or your aviation medical examiner during a medical, which if you're a pilot, you know how much of a big deal that is. A lot of pilots will avoid seeking help because of the concerns of their medical. The airline pilots have had something like this program for years, so it's great to see something similar now set up for helicopter pilots. So to learn more, you can go to www.ushstpeer.org, and then you can select Speak to a Peer from the menu, and then you can choose to be contacted either within 24 hours, 48 hours, or 7 days. Again, the link will be in the show notes. And finally, a huge thank you to YouTube members and Patreon supporters who are helping keep helicopter training videos and this podcast going. Most recent supporters are Robert, Mohammed, Novi, and Ronald. Thank you again. For anyone interested in supporting this project financially or otherwise, please check out the show notes for links and more information, or visit helicoptertrainingpodcast.com/support. You know, hovering is one of the most iconic and most challenging aspects of flying a helicopter, right? So it's the maneuver that everyone pictures when they think of helicopters, and to hover is one of the things that distinguishes it from being an airplane, for example, but it's also one of the hardest to master. A helicopter in a hover is at one of its most unstable aerodynamic conditions. Some people say it's like learning to ride a unicycle or balance on a ball whilst juggling and making radio calls. And if you're just starting out, it may feel a bit like that. So we're going to walk you through a few things in this episode. We're going to cover the controls in a hover, what each input does and how. We're going to dive into the hover aerodynamics, some of the weird interrelated forces at play. To understand that, help you understand why it's so difficult. We're also going to look at the FAA ACS or Airman Certification Standards as the requirements for your check ride as far as hovering goes. We're going to look at some training exercises and drills to help learn and get to those standards, as well as some tips for both students and instructors. We're not going to cover pickup and set down or air taxi or loss of tail rotor effectiveness. That's for other episodes. Also, I've packed this episode with a lot of visuals, diagrams, and video examples, so if you're listening to this and things don't make sense, you can view the visual version on your podcast app if it allows video support, or just go to Helicopter Training Video's YouTube channel and find the video podcast version. And hey, if you're already comfortable in a hover or you're an instructor, please leave us a comment or send a feedback to what helped you learn or teach hovering, and any advice you have for students who are just starting out. Okay, let's get started. So most of the examples in this episode are going to feature the most popular training helicopter in the world, which is the Robinson R-22. Now that has a standard, or what we call an American rotor system, which means when you're looking down from above, it has a counterclockwise main rotor rotation. But if you fly something like a Cabri G2, it has a clockwise rotation, which is the opposite of that. And I'll try to point out any relevant differences when we're talking about hovering. You may be wondering why they're different. So a little story here. Supposedly this goes back to the end of World War II. And in World War II there were very few helicopters at that point. And there's this story that at the end of the war, France and the US get hold of the wreckage of a German transverse twin rotor helicopter called the FA-223. And each half of that system rotates in an opposite direction to counter each other. So the US get one half, which is the counterclockwise, and the France gets the clockwise half. And there you have it. That was the genesis of why they have different rotating rotor systems. I'm not sure if I believe that, but it's a fun story. And if anyone knows any different, please let us know. So in this section, we'll do a quick breakdown of the primary flight controls used in a hover. I do have another video that goes through the flight controls in detail, and I'll put links to that in the show notes. But let's get started with the anti-torque pedals. The anti-torque pedals control the yaw axis of the helicopter. In other words, the direction the nose points in a hover. In a helicopter with a single main rotor, torque reaction wants to spin the helicopter in the opposite direction of the main rotor rotation. And therefore, in a hover, it will require constant anti-torque thrust from the tail rotor just to oppose the torque reaction of the main rotor blades and maintain a stable heading. In a counterclockwise rotation system like the R-22, that torque reaction wants to spin the helicopter's nose to the right, and so we require constant left pedal pressure to fight against that. That makes the left pedal what we call the power pedal. This also means that we need more left pedal as we increase the power to the main rotor. Now the Cabri G2 is opposite that, so the Cabri, the power pedal, is the right pedal. But in all helicopters, left pedal turns the nose left and right pedal turns the nose right. We just have different torque reaction and power pedals. In most helicopters, the tail rotor is geared to the main rotor, meaning that they both spin at the same constant speed. So yaw control is achieved by changing the tail rotor blade pitch angle and the amount of aerodynamic thrust that the tail rotor produces, not by changing how fast the tail rotor spins. And in the R22 and R44 helicopters, that is achieved with what's called push-pull tubes and bell cranks. And those run from the pedals all the way to the tail rotor. Some light helicopters will use cables. Also notice that the pedals are moving as a pair, so as one moves forward, the other one moves back. Now it's really important to have good foot placement, right? You've got to have your heels down on the floor of the aircraft and then have the balls of your feet on the pedals. Also, footwear matters, especially when you're learning. Just wear light, secure shoes, avoid heavy boots or flip-flops. No flip-flops. And yes, Fred North flies barefoot, but that's not recommended for flight training. Control inputs are mostly light and deliberate pressure rather than large movements. There's obviously some exceptions to that. Like I said, a helicopter like the R22, because of the torque reaction creating a right turning tendency of the helicopter, we are pushing left pedal or the power pedal pressure to maintain the heading. And so in a hover, the pedals won't be neutral and they'll usually be more left pedal applied. But the position will vary depending on the amount of power, the hover height, the amount of and direction of wind, and we'll cover some of this when we get to aerodynamics. Also air density and aircraft load, they all play a factor here. So a left turn is achieved by increasing pressure on the left pedal, squeezing the left pedal forward a little bit. And a right turn, certainly in an R22, is more about reducing the left pressure than really adding right pressure. So we want to allow the torque reaction to overcome the tail rotor thrust and start a right yaw. And we've always got to be very careful to control the yaw to the right, as it can easily get out of hand. And again, that would be opposite in the Cabri. You'd be watching out for a left yaw. And that's because the aircraft just wants to go in that direction. And to make things more complicated, if there's any wind at all, the amount of left or right pressure to turn the helicopter will change as the turn progresses and the relative wind interacts differently with the helicopter. This is just one part of what makes helicopters such a challenge, especially in the hover, and we'll cover why when we get into the aerodynamics section. Next up is the collective, and the collective controls altitude in a hover by adjusting all of the main rotor blades' pitch collectively. Generally, raising the collective increases pitch and lift, and the helicopter goes up, and lowering it reduces lift and it descends. Again, the R22 and R44 use push-pull tubes and bell cranks from the collective through to the swash plate and onto the blades. The R44 adds hydraulics to overcome the feedback forces from the larger rotor system. I have a short video on the swash plate and there'll be links in the show notes. Most helicopters have Correlator or a governor to help maintain the rotor speed, or revolutions per minute, or RPM as it's often referred to. These devices open and close the engine throttle to change the engine power output, as the flight control inputs change the amount of power required to maintain those RPMs. This episode is going to assume that if you're in an R22 or an R44, the governor is on and functioning normally. So while manipulating the collective, you must avoid a tight grip on the throttle and allow that governor to do its job. We're just monitoring the governor with one or two fingers lightly over the throttle grip. Throttle management will be covered in a future podcast episode, including governor off manual throttle training in forward flight and in a hover. But if you're interested, I do have a few videos of that kind of training with a student, and again, there'll be links in the show notes. But back to the collective. Small, controlled inputs are best. Avoid large or fast movements to ensure that the engine's got time to maintain the correct RPM as those changes in main rotor lift and drag are made. In the R22, there are no hydraulics, so sometimes there's going to require a little bit of upward pressure just to hold the collective where it is. Whatever you do, don't let go of the collective in a hover or when you're at full flight RPM on the ground with the friction off. So if needed, you've got to ask the instructor to take the controls, or if you're flying solo, set the helicopter down, apply the collective friction and or reduce RPM before letting go of the collective. Okay, next on to the cyclic control. So the cyclic is the primary control of the aircraft's lateral position during a hover. It controls forward, backwards, left and right movement or drift. It works by tilting the entire rotor disc and redirecting some of that lift to create horizontal thrust in a given direction. The R22 cyclic input goes through push-pull tubes again and bell cranks to the swash plate, It's the same system in the R44, though again the R44 is hydraulically assisted. So to avoid over-controlling this very sensitive control, rest your arm on your leg and fly with your fingers and wrist. Most of the inputs are pressure, they're barely visible, and like I said, cyclic control is extremely sensitive. The Robinson R22 and R44 have a T-bar cyclic that allows the controls to be tilted between pilots, but that tilt does not steer the helicopter. That's it for the controls. We're going to look at some training tips and drills and the ACS standards, etc. But first, let's look at the aerodynamics of a hover. To understand why hovering is so hard and why the helicopter is so unstable and power hungry in a hover, we need to look at the aerodynamics first. Helicopter aerodynamics are incredibly complex, so we're going to keep it relatively simple, believe it or not, and cover what you need to know as a pilot and not a NASA engineer. And to keep things simple, we're going to start with a no-wind hover. In a no-wind hover, the helicopter is relying solely on the relative wind over the blades that's caused by the rotation of the rotor disc, hence the name rotor wing or rotary wing. So a quick aside here, the Rotary Wing Show is another great helicopter podcast, originally by Mick Cullen, who's an Aussie pilot. New episodes really stopped around 2022, and I used to love listening to Mick. But I just heard from Max Trescott, who is of Aviation News Talk, another great aviation podcast, that he's taking over the show and bringing it back to life. So go subscribe if you haven't already to the Rotary Wing Show to get the new episodes, and also go back and check out all the great episodes that Mick did. The links will be in the show notes. Anyway, squirrel. Back to helicopter aerodynamics. As the blades spin around, they push the air down to stay aloft, and generate what is called induced flow. Induced flow is like a downward movement of the air through the rotor system, creating a column of air moving down through the rotor. And that's a byproduct of those rotor blades generating lift in a hover. You can see the airflow spiraling down through the rotor disc in this video, and increases in induced flow also increase something called induced drag and requires a large amount of engine power, especially when out of ground effect, which we'll cover in a second. Out of ground effect is when the rotor system is at least one rotor diameter away from the ground. And here the induced flow has no real resistance from the ground, and that can lead to increased induced flow rates and larger vortices that recirculate around the edge of the disc and reduce the effective lifting area of the rotor disc. Both of these things contribute to a reduction in the rotor disc lifting ability through changes in the angle of attack and the effective lifting area. We're not going to get into all the lift vectors and the angle of attack stuff in this podcast episode. Contrast this with hovering in ground effect, which is less than one rotor diameter from the surface. So that would be within 25 feet for an R22, which has a rotor diameter of about 25 feet. Now that surface, it interferes with that induced flow and reduces the induced flow rate and reduces the ability for those larger vortices to be generated around the edge of the rotor disc. So that's going to improve the lifting efficiency of the entire rotor disc and reduces the power requirements to hover. Now these differences can be significant, allowing a helicopter to be able to hover in ground effect with a much heavier load or in thinner air than when they are out of ground effect. And the closer you get to the ground, the more effective this change is. So manufacturers have published performance charts for out of ground effect and in ground effect performance, and they stipulate the hover height for which the in ground effect chart applies, and it's often much closer to the ground than this one rotor diameter we just talked about. For example, the R22 and the R44, their in-ground effect performance charts, they don't say within 25 feet, they say within a 2-foot skid height. And so anything above that, you should be using the out-of-ground effect hover chart to assess performance. And when operating off airport, it's a good idea to never assume in-ground effect performance and to use these out-of-ground effect hover charts. Now, sometimes you're going to hear people referring to in-ground effect and out-of-ground effect as IGE and OGE, but also you'll sometimes hear them put a H in front of it for hover, and they'll say hoagie and higgy, which to me sounds a lot like a Sesame Street character. Also, something to note is not all surfaces are equal, so a flat, hard concrete pad has more effect, in-ground effect, than a sloping hill with vegetation or even water, for example. You can see here an accident that occurred in part because the aircraft didn't have in-ground effect performance over the water. So if you're hovering out of ground effect, you're going to have a higher power requirement, which is also going to lead to a higher torque reaction. So that's something to keep in mind too. But what exactly is torque reaction? As the engine pushes the helicopter blades one way, the fuselage of the helicopter wants to spin in the opposite direction due to Newton's third law of motion. To every action, there is always an equal and opposite reaction. Because the reaction is a rotational force in the helicopter, we call it torque reaction. So when sitting in a helicopter pilot's seat and looking out the front of an American helicopter like the R-22, you can imagine the blades move from right to left as the helicopter starts to spin up. So that will help you remember that the torque reaction will go the opposite direction. It will try to push the nose right. Now, of course, again, if you fly something like a Cabri, this is all reversed. But back to the R-22 and American counterclockwise rotational systems, remember the helicopter wants to spin the nose to the right. And it's the job of the tail rotor and your left foot on that pedal to make sure that doesn't happen, unless you want it to happen. And then it's going to be a slow, controlled turn to the right. Else, you can start to lose control of the aircraft. There's a hazard called loss of tail rotor effectiveness, or LTE, which we'll go into in a future episode, but it can cause an uncommanded yaw that can lead to loss of control of the aircraft. For now, you need to know that you must make all pedal turns, left or right really, slowly and carefully, and never let the aircraft get away from you. So the pedals control the amount of anti-torque thrust produced by the tail rotor, and any time the collective is raised or lowered, the engine is producing more or less power, which changes the torque reaction on the airframe. So to maintain heading, pedal input must be adjusted to match this change in torque. I kind of think about like driving a car, and any time you push the gas pedal or brake pedal, imagine that the car swerves to the left or right. And I had a car that used to do this. But with experience, this collective and pedal coordination becomes instinctive. But for now, as you're just learning, keep your eyes outside and apply whatever pedal input is required to hold your desired heading. So while the tail rotor counters the torque reaction to maintain heading, it also introduces more aerodynamic complications, something called translating tendency or translating drift. So in a helicopter with a counterclockwise rotor system like the R-22, while you're maintaining a hover, the tail rotor thrust acts to the right, and that has the effect of drifting the helicopter to the right. And the more tail rotor thrust or left pedal that you apply, the more that lateral drift to the right occurs. And of course, reverse all this for counterclockwise systems like the Cabri G2. So this drift is countered in a variety of ways, from pilot input with some opposite cyclic, to cyclic rigging, so your center position actually has some input already on the rotor system, to also a offset of the main rotor transmission mast. In the R-22, I believe the drift is offset by cyclic rigging and pilot input. Whatever the way of opposing this drift, often causes the helicopter to sit slightly tilted away from the translating tendency. So the R-22 often sits with the left skid slightly low in a hover. But of course, wind and weight distribution can affect that too. So in summary, in a helicopter like the R-22, if you raise the collective to increase hover height, generally you will need to add more left pedal to counter the torque, and that causes additional right translating drift, which you need to add some left cyclic to offset, but that takes some of the vertical main rotor lift to create horizontal thrust, and that also starts a slight descent. So then you need to add more collective, and we go round and round in a circle. So welcome to hovering, right? Lots of small coordinated inputs just to hold position. There's no secret spot to hold all the controls where everything will stop. It just doesn't work that way. There's just this constant inputs. So there's a saying, people fly airplanes, pilots fly helicopters. Now, if you're an airplane pilot, you might not appreciate that, but there's a lot more hands-on, obviously, in a helicopter than there is in an airplane. And it's challenging, it's difficult, but I think it's worth it. So, as we already mentioned, the lateral position of the helicopter in a hover is controlled by the cyclic control. the main rotor disc is producing enough lift to offset the weight of the helicopter, and if we want to move the helicopter forward or backwards or drift left or right, we need to offset some of that vertical lift to what's called horizontal thrust or horizontal lift to start moving laterally. And that will usually mean that the helicopter will start to settle as the vertical component lift will be less than the weight of the helicopter. But assuming we're still in a no-wind situation for simplicity, as the main rotor starts to move out of its own recirculation, out of that induced flow into smooth, undisturbed air, the main rotor actually starts to become more efficient through something called translational lift. And even just a few knots of more horizontal airflow can reduce the negative effects of induced flow and start to increase the main rotor lift. This performance boost can also work on the tail rotor too, but it's called translational thrust. And as that tail rotor becomes more efficient, it can require a change in the tail rotor pedals to maintain heading. Another factor is the vertical and horizontal stabilizers if the aircraft has one or both of these. The purpose of the vertical stabilizer is to help maintain heading in forward flight and unload some of that tail rotor thrust requirement. It is also important in an emergency where you lose total tail rotor thrust, say a bird hits a tail rotor, and it gives some control in forward flight. But in a hover, it can kind of work as a hindrance, because if the helicopter's hovering sideways or backwards, or there's wind from either side or the rear, it can start to cause the helicopter to weather vane and try to spin the helicopter's nose into the wind. The horizontal stabilizer is actually an upside down wing that creates downforce to keep the helicopter relatively level at higher speeds. So without that, the fuselage would tilt nose down as the main rotor disc is tilted forward at faster flight speeds. Again, in a hover, this can be a problem because if you're trying to hover backwards too fast or you have a strong tailwind, the airflow can catch the surface of that stabilizer and try to push the tail down or up. So always be careful when hovering with a tailwind or hovering backwards. Getting the hang of all this? Well, guess what? There's one more frustration in a hover, and that's called the pendulum effect. So the way the helicopter is suspended in a hover by the main rotor at a single point, and cyclic input moves the main rotor disc first, and because the center of gravity of the aircraft is below the main rotor disc, the body of the helicopter then follows. So this can lead to the helicopter kind of swinging under the main rotor like a pendulum. It's more apparent in a semi-rigid rotor system like those in an R22 or a Bow 206. It's also most noticeable when first transitioning from a stationary hover to a hover taxi or a takeoff run. It can also be seen when trying to stop as the body of the helicopter will swing back under the disc. The larger the control input, the greater the effect. So keep your eyes outside and make all those cyclic adjustments small to fix the attitude if the nose comes up or drops from where you want it to be. A lot of these problems are made worse by the pilot looking at the ground or nearby instead of out to the horizon, where you'll notice even small changes in the aircraft attitude. We've just been looking at no-wind situations where there's an imaginary world where there's no wind, but the reality is you'll often be flying with some wind of some amount. The wind will have a similar effect to the helicopter in a no-wind situation, but hovering in that direction. So for example, if there's a wind from the right, you'll be like the helicopter in a no-wind situation drifting to the right. There'll be the same effect on the main rotor, getting more efficient, and the vertical fin will try to turn the helicopter nose to the right into the wind. And the stronger the winds get, the greater the effect. Also, when we start getting above 10 knots or so wind, we start getting into new aerodynamic situations such as dissymmetry of lift and transverse flow effect and effective translational lift. But we'll cover those along with other things such as coning and Coriolis effect, gyroscopic precession, and more in future episodes when we talk about takeoff and landing and involving faster helicopter airspeeds. All of this is to help you understand there's a lot going on in just the hover. So be patient with yourself if you're trying to learn this skill. And before we look at some of the training exercises and tips, we're going to look at what the FAA defines as the minimum standard for hovering to pass your private and commercial check ride or practical test. The current FAA private pilot and commercial pilot ACS or Airman Certification Standard both require hovering tasks, but the level of precision or control required is obviously slightly higher for the commercial certificate. We're going to ignore most of the knowledge items and focus on the actual hovering skills required for the assessment. But it's worth noting that while hovering, you still got to be mindful of those risk management items like distractions and loss of situation awareness, like where's the other aircraft or vehicles or persons, and the hazardous effects of your downwash, as well as main rotor and tail rotor clearance and tail strike hazards. I'm kind of surprised there's no mention of loss of tail rotor effectiveness or LTE in the risk management section of those ACS tasks. Hey, and certainly speak up to the evaluator if you think that there's an LTE risk and you have some concern, and you may need to modify the heading of the aircraft to avoid that and demonstrate good risk management or aeronautical decision making, or ADM. As for the assessment of aircraft control in a hover, the key numbers are these. So first of all, you have to be able to hover along a straight line within 4 feet of the line, or 2 feet for commercial. You have to be able to maintain a hover altitude within half of the recommended hover height. So that would depend on the helicopter, but for a light training helicopter, we're really talking about somewhere between 2 to 6 feet. You also need to demonstrate hover taxiing in all directions, forwards, sideways and backwards, and be able to perform a 360-degree hover turn both left and right, whilst maintaining a constant rate of turn and staying within 4 feet of the pivot point, or 2 feet for commercial, and being able to stop within 10 degrees of a specified heading. But to be honest, you're going to do a lot of this just moving the helicopter from pickup point to takeoff point, and most people have this skill well in hand before they get to the check ride. I don't think I've ever heard of an applicant failing a check ride for the hovering tasks. So next, let's talk about some training exercises and drills to help get you up to those standards. First of all, I'd say most students average about 10 hours to achieve a really solid and stable hover. Some get it sooner, especially if they've got experience with heavy machinery, flight sims, or even just great natural skill, I guess. But others take 15, 20, or even more hours. It really depends on a lot. There's wind during the training flights, the instructor, the airframe. Some are easier than others, how often you're flying, and really your mental attitude. You can really get inside your own head with this. So at the Robertson Instructor Standardization course I recently attended, there was a discussion about the significant number of accidents due to loss of control in a hover, even involving experienced pilots. So this is a skill we must remember that we can always improve on. Don't stop developing it just because you're past the solo phase. But let's first focus on the new pilot. With a brand new pilot, before we even try hovering, as an instructor, I'd usually start them at altitude with forward airspeed, 60 to 70 knots. The aircraft's much more stable there, and then I'd get them to try the controls one at a time before we even start on hover training. So let's just assume that's already been done, and they've got a feel for each control in an easier flight profile. Hover training should begin in a safe environment. So we're talking about relatively low winds, facing into the wind if there is any, and then progressively move to more advanced drills and higher wind speeds. A higher hover altitude is often used early on to give the students and the instructors a bit more time to react. I would also suggest hover work over a smooth, hard surface rather than grass or sod. Just in case you accidentally do make ground contact, you don't want the skids or the tail skid or stinger to catch like it did in this incident, where the tail stinger caught and dug in. And again, a reminder, frustration in hover training is common. So it's important to recognize when a student has reached their kind of useful training limit, and either the instructor takes the controls to give them a break, or maybe move on to a different maneuver, such as pattern work, flying around the pattern, or pickups and set downs, at least for a bit. When first learning to hover, it's really useful to work on one control at a time in what's called control isolation. And say the student takes just the pedals and the instructor takes the collective and cyclic. That way the student can really focus on just one control without the complexities and the interactions of all three control inputs. They can just feel out one control at a time. It's really, really important that both pilots agree on who's responsible for what control and speak up if they're unsure. To ensure a positive exchange of controls, as it's called, there should be 3 stages of exchange. So for example, the instructor says, you have the pedals, I have the collective and the cyclic. The student then brings their feet up into position onto the pedals with light pressure on the pedals. And when they're ready, the student then says, as the second stage, I have the pedals. As the third stage, the instructor looks to confirm that the student has their feet in place and then says, you have the pedals. That's the third stage, as they slowly take their feet off the pedals, as the instructor slowly takes their feet off the pedals. When first learning any maneuver, you can expect the instructor to be very close on the controls for safety. But if you're finding they're interfering with your free movement of controls, if you're feeling like you're hitting up against their feet or hands, you can always ask, is that you I'm feeling on the pedals or the controls, or is that normal? And whatever you do, never just let go or give up on a control. Always use a positive exchange of controls. When first learning to fly a helicopter, we often start with control isolation, like I said, just the pedals. The instructor would demonstrate good foot position, show you how to keep your heels on the floor, and adjust pressure on the pedals using just the balls of your feet. Another good thing for the instructor to demonstrate to a student is that typically the power pedal, which would be the left pedal in a counterclockwise system like the R22, will be further forward than the right pedal in a hover, as the hover is like a high power setting and requires more anti-torque thrust. So don't try to fly the helicopter straight in a hover by leveling the pedals. And to be honest, don't look down at all. Just look outside, at least 50 feet ahead, and fix any movement of the nose as needed, regardless of the pedal position. The instructor should also demonstrate or remind the student that a counterclockwise helicopter like the 22 will naturally want to turn to the right, and you'll need to hold left pedal pressure just to hold heading. And so to turn right, you're only really giving up left pedal pressure. You're not really pushing a bunch of right pedal. You're really just letting the torque reaction turn the helicopter to the right. And remember, the pedals are linked and they move as a pair. I usually start students on the pedals while I hover the helicopter along a straight line using the cyclic and collective. I ask the student just to hold our heading along the line. Imagine we're on a train following the tracks, which would be the yellow line in front of us. In our heliport, we've got some curved lines, and that allows us to follow with some left and right turns. And then once they've got the hang of that, I will move on to a stationary hover, and I will demonstrate a complete 360-degree turn, and I'll stop at every 90 degrees. I'll also point out how wind might be affecting each position and how different the amount of power pedal is needed to hold each position and to make those turns. I always clear my tail before turning, and that's an important primacy to show the student. Here's a quick video of an R44 that unfortunately hit the hanger as they made a pedal turn. So don't be like Charlie in this video clip. Always clear the tail before pedal turns. So then we practice 90-degree turns and 360-degree turns in both directions, and we're trying to stop within 10 degrees. I'd also notice how the counterclockwise helicopter may try to race ahead with the right turns, and we'll have to add left pedal pressure to control the turn rate. But as we go, if we've got any kind of wind, this will change depending on the wind direction, and we may end up having to put opposite pedal in to control the turn rate. I then take back all 3 controls and demonstrate there's a torque-yaw relationship. I get kind of lazy on the pedals, making no correction as I raise the collective, and I show that there's a right yaw, and lowering the collective, I show that there's a left yaw because of the torque reaction in a counterclockwise rotor system. And then as the instructor, whenever I make these kind of demonstrations, it's really important to preface it with the word generally. And you've probably heard me say this a few times in this podcast. Generally, it does ABC. If you don't do that, the one time you try to demonstrate something, there's going to be a freak wind or something like that that's going to turn the helicopter opposite to what you told them it would do. It's also important to not get too locked into what you expect the helicopter to do, and to remember, use the pedals as needed to control the heading. I then give just the pedals to the student and ask them to closely follow along with the collective in the left hand so they can feel the changes in torque, and I ask them to keep the nose facing the line as I increase and decrease the torque. Usually the student finds it somewhat tricky to start with, but generally makes pretty good progress at this point, so I often move onto the collective. I make sure I have all three controls back, and then I ask the student to focus along with following the collective movements as I hover along and change the height with the collective. I point out that they may need a bit of constant up pressure to hold the collective where it is, as the collective may try to droop, and how small the movements are. I also point out, partly due to inertia, there's a slight delay between the input and the results. I also show that in a hover, an up or down collective movement generally makes a slight change in height, and then we stabilize again due to the changes in ground effect. So we may need to make another input if we want to go higher or lower. So it's not really an on-off switch or an up-down switch. It's more of a add more, add less, and then adjust as necessary. I then go back to control isolation and give the student, just the collective, reminding them to keep most, or if not all, of the hand off the throttle to allow the throttle to work. They may tense up a little bit, so I want to make sure that the throttle can move freely. I then get them to move us up and down as I control the hover position and the heading with the cyclic and pedals. And maybe I'll be driving us along a straight line. Again, the students usually make pretty good progress with this, and so I often move straight on to the next stage. Next, I give the student both the collective and the pedals while I have the cyclic as the instructor. So now they must add the torque reaction to their workload. As always during this level of training, as the instructor, I'm relatively close to the pedals and collective to make sure they don't push the wrong pedal or dump the collective or just make overly large inputs. This is often where I might start to see a sense of frustration in a student, especially if there's any kind of wind affecting the hover. As the instructor, I'm always ready to take all three controls before they get too frustrated. Even if they're struggling a little bit here, I still like to move on and give them at least a taste of the cyclic at this point. Like I said, even if there's still obviously quite a bit of work left to do with the collective and pedal training, the cyclic control is by far the most challenging, dangerous, and to me at least, the most fun part of hover training. I say fun because it often feels and looks like someone trying to ride a bucking bronco. Again, having a slightly higher hover is essential for safety and reminding the student, A, this is the most frustrating part, and B, do not let go of the controls until the instructor has them, no matter how scary it's feeling. I first like to take all three controls and get the student to follow along, really closely focusing on the cyclic whilst looking outside at the horizon. I need them to sense how small those inputs are and how there is a slight delay in the outcome, and how looking out to the horizon will definitely help identify those changes in attitude that you need to fix with the cyclic input. Treat the whole windshield and the horizon as like a big attitude indicator to help identify and fix unwanted changes to the attitude of the aircraft, and that's what the cyclic does. It's also good to demonstrate and remind students that due to the inertia of the aircraft, there is this delay between input and the desired result. And for most cyclic inputs, there is two stages. There's the initial input to either start or stop the drift, and then there's a second cyclic adjustment to stabilize the new state. Tricky, I know. I then start a stabilized but slightly brisk hover taxi forward about 5 feet above the ground before I give the student the cyclic. This is to avoid much of the pendulum effect and tail rotor pedal adjustments, etc. that go into going from stationary hover to forward hover taxi. And then we see how far we get. And as any of you who've learned to hover will know, this can be an interesting part of your training. And it just needs repetition. You just need to feel the helicopter out and understand the relationship between the cyclic and the desired attitude and movement of the aircraft. And as they get better at that, I start to give them all three controls. Often the pedals get forgotten at this stage. They're really focusing on the collective, or probably more focusing on the cyclic. And, it's a lot for a student to take all three controls and try to maintain a stabilized hover. That's not really what we're looking for at this point. We're just giving them exposure and starting to kind of build confidence and build on from what we've done before. I never stay on hover training over and over until they just get it. I mix in other training like flying the pattern down to a go around, and of course we can do this away from the airport too, so we don't have to worry about traffic calls, radios, etc. I also work on pickups and set downs, often again with control isolation, and we keep working on hovering as we're also working on these other pieces. And what I find is typically we're progressing on the pattern work, the forward flight work, and the hover work at the same time, and we keep going round to a lower and slower go around, and then just one session they do a pattern, they make an approach, and all of a sudden we're in a 5-foot brisk hover taxi, and before they know it they're hovering without even realizing or trying.
Whoa, back controls. Yeah, the control loose on the pedals.
So now the students got the basics of hovering, we can start working on more deliberate and challenging drills in higher and higher winds if it's safe to do so. So here's some of the drills I like to do with students. First of all, once they've got the hang of all three controls in a hover, we start working on basic pedal turns, all three controls, flying sideways and backwards, obviously a bit higher so that we clear our tail, and slower when we go backwards. Another great one is if you have a helipad or some sort of rectangle or square, you can follow the edge. You can do that by facing into the wind, or you can follow it by turning on each corner. Another thing you can do is you can keep the nose of the aircraft facing into the box and drive it around the edge. Another thing you can do with this is you can add pickups and set downs on each corner. So if you're just driving along the lines, you get to a corner, you set down, pick up, turn 90 degrees, follow the line, set down, pick up. What I like about that particular drill is it's going to work on not only your basic hover skills, but also your pickups and set downs in every wind direction. You can, of course, also do this with a circle. You can either drive around the circle, or you can have the aircraft facing into the wind and move around the circle, or you can have your aircraft with the nose facing into the center of the circle and kind of work on going around more of a sort of sideways and combined pedal turn. And of course you can do that in both directions. Also turns about the tail, which has a practical application of keeping your tail in a known safe spot. Another great one I really like are pirouettes. And you can start with a straight line and you just fly the helicopter nose into the direction of travel. Whilst maintaining that travel, you then start a 90-degree turn and you hold it, and you're now moving sideways. Obviously clearing in the direction you're moving, and then you make another right 90-degree turn, another right 90-degree turn, and now you're going backwards down the line, and then another 90-degree turn, and you're trying to do this while making a continuous movement down the line. And of course you're fighting different wind directions. And then once you've done the basics with the 90-degree stops, then we can do, in both directions, then we can do a continuous turn pirouette where the aircraft is moving down the line, but the aircraft's in a controlled 360-degree pedal turn and then back the other way. You can really spice this up now by doing the same thing around a box or around a circle, turning in both directions. Any other favorite drills I've missed, please let us know. I'm sure you have your own that you've either done or that you instruct with, so send those to us in the comments or in the feedback. And not for this video, but once the student gets to Governor failure training, don't forget to do some hover work Governor off. Maybe not pirouettes, but make sure that any Governor off work you do is in safe conditions. Maybe do an approach to a landing area and then hover the aircraft back to parking. Obviously, assuming the winds are safe to do so. Gusty conditions, this can be a little bit dangerous. Okay, let's summarize some tips for learning or teaching hovering. Firstly, for students. Everyone finds it hard at first. You've got to give yourself time. It will come. And don't compare yourself to your classmates. And remember, even experienced pilots can get stressed when trying to hover in really challenging conditions. So avoid gusty and high wind days when you're trying to learn the basics of hovering. Now, as you get better, you obviously want to expand your abilities with different winds, but start off easy. Try to stay calm, relax, take a deep breath, avoid tensing up. Take a break if you're noticing that you're getting tense. Notice your hands. Are you death gripping? Are you death gripping the controls? Look outside. Look outside. Avoid staring inside the cockpit or down at the ground. Use a reference point or the horizon instead of fixating on something too close, and that will help you spot those small changes to attitude. Always, always, always clear your tail before turning. Like I said, use a relaxed grip on the cyclic to avoid over-controlling, so rest your arm and just fly with your wrist and your fingers. It's smooth, tiny control inputs. Less is more. It's more pressure than large movements generally. And no matter how scared or frustrated, never let go of the controls until your instructor has them. Understand that there's delays in the system because of inertia. Recognize how the inputs can take a little time to affect the aircraft. Otherwise you get into this over-controlling oscillation. Understand the aerodynamics and the interrelated control effects. We've sort of talked a little bit about those. Remember, there's no perfect control position to solve the hover, to stop all movement. There's always going to be constant small corrections. The pedals. If you think you might be a person who might get the left and right mixed up a little bit from maybe prior experience running a track steer vehicle or something like that, say in your head, left goes left, right goes right, to reinforce the proper input. Simulators, whether it's a full-on aviation training device or just a home PC or an Xbox, they can be harder because you have a lack of movement and you don't have the same depth perception, but they can be useful to work on the small movements and the general inputs. Or maybe you or someone you know is handy enough to make something like this. This was made by one of the new students that came to the flight school. This one's a prototype, but he's working on trying to make it a bit more professional grade, and his contact details are in the description of the show. And for instructors, try to start your students in calm wind conditions. I know that's not always going to be possible. And gradually reduce the insistence on the controls. Ask your students just to focus on one control at a time initially. Use that control isolation technique. And even when you have got to the point where they are using all the controls, keep pushing the student comfort levels. Even short flights in slightly windier conditions can help build their confidence and their skills. Make clearing before turning a strict habit, primacy, reinforce it. Initially get students to aim for hovering in a general area instead of insisting on a specific spot. Recognize the frustration and the fatigue. Make sure you give your student a break, either take the controls or get them to work on something different, maybe pickups and set downs or a different control isolation or go-do patterns. Mix it up. Watch out for that arm-hand position. Look to see if they are not bracing or if they're over-gripping. Recognize overcorrections early and guide them back to stability before it gets too out of hand. Encourage your students to anticipate movement rather than react to the drift. And demo things like the pendulum effect and other aerodynamic effects so the student knows what to watch out for. Show errors for things like when you raise the collective, if they don't put the pedal in, how the aircraft's going to twist, etc. And demonstrate those other aerodynamics in action. Give yourself enough margins to be able to take controls and stay close on the controls on these initial stages. Keep it safe. So, what tips do you have for learning or teaching hovering? Please send us that feedback and we'll probably read it out or listen to it on the show. Talking to feedback, I've got a feedback here from Bill. Hey, I've been thinking about starting my training soon and found a local school that uses only R44s. Is it a good idea to do all my training in the R44 or should I look for somewhere that starts in the R22? Curious about the pros and cons, Bill from Utah. Hey, that's a great question, Bill. Training entirely in the R44 does offer some clear advantages. It's more spacious, it's generally more stable, it is easier to learn in and widely used in commercial operations like tours, charters, and utility work. So if you plan to work in an R44 later, the training in one would make it a little bit easier and give you some time towards that goal. That said, the R44 is significantly more expensive to rent, and starting the R22 can save you money and help develop those finer control inputs, seeing as it's lighter and more sensitive, and those skills transfer well, obviously, to its bigger aircraft, the R44. One major consideration, though, I'd say, is future employment, because most flight schools that hire instructors use the R22, and under SFAR 73, you need at least 50 hours in the R22 to instruct in it. But in reality, most schools, ours included, would really want to see more than the bare minimum to ensure you're safe and effective as an instructor. So if you only train in the R44, you're really limiting your job opportunities to R44 flight schools. So if your school doesn't hire you, how many other opportunities do you have? You may have to invest in significant additional R22 time later at your own expense. So I'd say to get the best of both worlds, consider a school that incorporates training in both the R22 and the R44, and that way you reduce costs, you build broader skills and experience, and you keep more employment doors open as an instructor, and later on if you want to go and do some R44 industry work. But in the end, it really comes down to your goals, your budget, the location, are you prepared to move, and what you see yourself doing after training. Thanks again for your feedback, Bill, and if anyone else has any thoughts on that, please send them in and I'll read them out on the next episode. Next feedback we have is from Austin. This is audio feedback, so let's have a listen.
Hey, how are you doing? My question is this. For somebody looking to go all the way, get all their ratings, make a career out of it, in terms of worrying about going beyond 200 hours and wanting to, stick tight to that time schedule of, not ending up spending more on school than you need to, do you find that generally most students are able to get everything done within 200 hours? I guess I really can't tell at this point if it's the kind of thing where you'll end up, at 160 hours with everything done and you need to burn 30, 40 hours just doing whatever to, complete the number of hours you need for that CFI. Just for reference, right now, I just got my private pilot. I'm at 57 hours. So I think I'm in a pretty good place, but I just don't know how efficient I need to be with all my flights. Is it something I should be worried about, or is it not really a concern? Thanks.
Hey, Austin, thanks for sending in the feedback, and congratulations on getting private pilot done. That's a big milestone. Private instrument have a steep learning curve. That's usually where students can get held up. The national average for private is around 70 hours, so you're well ahead of the curve there at 57. And now you're working on instrument. Part 61 and 141 have different requirements for instrument, and I know from emailing Austin that he's doing instrument part 61. The biggest requirement there will be getting those 50 hours PIC cross-country. But either way, whichever way you do it, most students would come out finishing instrument maybe up to 110, even 120 if they went part 61. And the next big target is the commercial certificate, and that requires 150 hours total time and 100 PIC. So you're likely building anywhere between 30 to 60 hours during that phase, depending on the route you came through. You may need taking private pilot maneuvers to a commercial level with some extra long cross-country and some hood work. So on those dual instruction flights, you can even start practicing flying in the instructor's seat and teaching if you want to get ahead of the curve a little bit. Make sure you try and get plenty of nighttime. That's always valuable later on. The ground isn't much different from the private pilot, really. There's a few new regulations to look at for commercial ops. So this is also a good time if you want to be super efficient to start looking at making lesson plans, studying ahead for the FOIs, the fundamentals of instruction. You can even take your CFI and FOI knowledge tests towards the end of that training as well if you prepare it. Some people use this time to get some different experience. So they may go to a different flight school to do maybe 10 or 20 hours and even in a different airframe. So hey, come visit Central Oregon for a week. Come fly with me and we'll do some fun off airports and some advanced maneuvers. Another consideration is getting at least 25 hours in the R44 if you can, so that you can teach in that airframe too. That can improve your job options. Many pilots will be at that commercial check ride with very similar hours. They're all going to be around the same for the most part, regardless how private an instrument went. So if you finish the commercial with the absolute minimum of 150 hours, you're about another 50 hours to go to get all the way up to 200 hours to be able to teach in Robinson helicopters. So 50 hours to do CFI and CFII, definitely doable. I'd say that most of the students that come through the program, or most of the instructors that we interview, whether through our program or elsewhere, are sitting somewhere between 200 and 220 hours when they finish the entire training programs. So the bottom line is, track your progress, talk to your instructor and any mentors you have, and you can add me to that list. Make sure to get the most out of every training opportunity, and assuming that you continue to progress through instrument like you did through private, you're really not going to have to be worried about this. You'll get there around 200 hours, no problem. I hope that answers your question. Thanks for sending in the feedback, and stay in touch with your progress. Well, that's it. That pretty much wraps up episode 2 of the Helicopter Training Podcast. Please send in your feedback and questions. How was hovering for you? How was your training? Do you have any tips to pass on? So send it in to us either as a written message or record a quick audio message at helicoptertrainingpodcast.com/contact. One more thing, a big thank you to the pilots that helped get the video footage for this episode. Justin, Howard, Jack and Ripley, Scott, Colson and Daniel, and Clay, thanks again. And as always, all the links and videos mentioned in the episode are in the episode show notes in your podcast player or in the description if you're watching this on YouTube. A couple of quick updates here. While I was working on editing this episode to get it out, the Rotorcraft Collective video that I mentioned earlier that I've been working on came out. It's called Recognize the Early Signs of Undesired Aircraft State, so I'll post the link to that video. Also, Max Trescott released the first new episode of the Rotary Wing Show, which I also mentioned. On that episode, he's talking with the old host Mick Cullen about their favourite past episodes and the future of the show. I'm really looking forward to hearing more from that show, and actually Max and I are talking about working together on an episode. Talking of future episodes. Watch out for the next episode, which will be covering Autorotations, one of my favourite manoeuvres and an essential skill to master as a helicopter pilot. We'll cover the aerodynamics, the check ride standards, and of course lots of tips on the entry, the glide, the flare, for both students and instructors. So send in your questions for that episode, and don't forget to subscribe or follow to make sure you get that episode when it comes out. Thank you for tuning in to the Helicopter Training Podcast. So if you found this episode useful, please take a moment, rate and review the show in your podcast app, because those reviews and ratings make a huge difference helping others discover the show and grow the community. Please also just share the podcast with any friends or colleagues or anyone else you think would be passionate about helicopters. Don't forget to subscribe or follow to make sure you never miss a future episode. And we'd love to hear from you. If you've got questions, topic suggestions, or want to share your experiences, your frustrations, and your successes, head out to helicoptertrainingpodcast.com/contact. Your feedback really helps improve the show, make each episode even better. Finally, if you found value in this podcast, please visit helicoptertrainingpodcast.com/support. And there you can find a bunch of ways to support the show, both financially and otherwise, to help the show keep going. Thanks again for listening, fly safe, and we'll see you on the next episode.